Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to talk about a newly released Chinese drama called The Lion's Captive. In this video, I will explain the full story of this drama in detail and give you a complete breakdown from beginning to end. This drama is packed with dark romance, royal politics, dangerous secrets, emotional twists, and intense moments that make the story very addictive to watch. It is not just a love story, but a battle between power, control, and unexpected feelings. The story follows Elena, a simple young woman whose peaceful life suddenly turns upside down after one secret puts her in grave danger. To survive, she is forced into a marriage with the most feared man in the empire, Prince Cain, also known as the Lion King. Cold, powerful, and mysterious, Cain is a man no one dares to challenge. But when Elena enters his world, everything begins to change. As the story moves forward, hidden truths are revealed, enemies rise, and a dangerous connection starts to grow between them. So make sure to watch this video till the end, because this drama is full of suspense, emotional scenes, and shocking twists. Now, let's begin the complete story of The Lion's Captive. The story of The Lion's Captive begins inside a vast and unforgiving empire where power controls every aspect of life. In this kingdom, laws are not created to protect people. They exist to keep fear alive. Every citizen knows their place, and anyone who dares to step beyond the rules is punished without mercy. The nobles live behind walls of luxury, while ordinary people struggle each day just to survive. In such a cruel world, hope is a dangerous thing to hold on to. Among the countless people living quietly under the empire's shadow was a young woman named Elena. She was not rich, noble, or important. She came from a simple background and had spent her entire life trying to remain unnoticed. Elena understood that in a place ruled by harsh men and brutal laws, survival often depended on silence. She kept her head down, worked hard, and avoided trouble whenever possible. Unlike many others around her, Elena still carried kindness in her heart. Even after seeing injustice all her life, she had not allowed bitterness to consume her. She helped those she could, shared what little she had, and dreamed of a future where she might one day live peacefully far away from the empire's cruelty. But dreams were fragile in a place like this, and Elena knew reality often destroyed them. The empire was especially cruel toward women. They were judged more harshly, controlled more strictly, and blamed for sins committed by others. A woman's reputation could determine whether she lived in safety or shame. Even false rumors were enough to ruin lives. Because of this, women learned to hide their emotions, lower their voices, and obey rules that men themselves often ignored. Elena had grown up hearing terrifying stories whispered in secret. Women who disappeared overnight. Families destroyed because of accusations. Innocent people punished simply because someone powerful wanted an example to be made. No one spoke openly about these things, but everyone knew they were true. Fear traveled faster than truth ever could. Despite the darkness surrounding her world, Elena tried to build a quiet life. She found comfort in small routines. Morning sunlight through the window. Fresh bread from the market. Brief laughter shared with trusted friends. These simple moments reminded her that life still had beauty, even in a broken place. She held tightly to those moments because they were all she truly owned. But fate often changes lives without warning. One evening, after a long and exhausting day, Elena's path crossed with a stranger she had never seen before. He was tall, calm, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Yet he wore no royal symbols, no visible signs of status. To Elena, he seemed like an ordinary traveler passing through the city. Their meeting was brief, unexpected, and born from a moment of emotional weakness. Elena had spent years carrying loneliness in silence. The stranger spoke gently, listened without judgment, and for the first time in a long while, she felt seen rather than ignored. In a world where human warmth was rare, that moment felt powerful. Neither of them knew how deeply that encounter would change everything. What seemed small and temporary would soon become the center of a storm neither could escape. The empire was not forgiving, and choices made in private often carried public consequences. Weeks passed, and Elena began to feel something was wrong. Her body changed in ways she could not ignore. At first, she denied what she feared. Then came the truth she could no longer escape. Elena was pregnant. The realization shattered her peace instantly. Fear rushed through her like ice. In this empire, an unmarried woman carrying a child was not treated with compassion. She was treated as disgrace, a threat to social order, and proof of moral failure. Punishment was swift, public, and cruel. Elena knew exactly what could happen if anyone discovered her secret. She spent nights awake, unable to breathe properly, imagining guards at her door and crowds whispering her name with hatred. Every sound outside made her heart race. Every stranger's glance felt suspicious. Her once quiet life had become a prison built from fear. Elena tried to hide the pregnancy. She wore loose clothing, avoided crowded places, and spoke to no one about what she was facing. She considered running away, but the empire's borders were heavily guarded. She had no money, no protection, and nowhere safe to go. Escape was only a dream, and dreams rarely survived reality. As days turned into weeks, pressure grew heavier. Secrets are difficult to bury in places built on surveillance. Neighbors noticed changes. Whispers began softly. Questions followed. Elena could feel attention turning toward her, and attention in this empire was often the first step toward destruction. At the same time, rumors spread through the capital about the empire's most feared ruler, Prince Cain. Known by many as the Lion King, Cain was a man surrounded by stories darker than truth itself. Some claimed he had no heart. Others said he ruled with such absolute control that even powerful nobles trembled when he entered a room. Many believed he was more dangerous than the laws he enforced. Elena had never seen Prince Cain, but she had heard his name enough times to understand what it meant: authority, fear, and silence. No one challenged him. No one understood him. And no one expected mercy from a man like that. While Elena struggled to keep her secret hidden, forces larger than her life were already moving. Inside the palace, powerful officials discussed disorder spreading among the people. They demanded stricter enforcement of morality laws. They wanted examples made. Public punishment created obedient citizens, and fear was easier to maintain when blood had recently been spilled. Elena, without knowing it, was becoming exactly the kind of example they wanted. One morning, everything changed. Soldiers arrived in her district without warning. Their armor carried the imperial crest, and their expressions were empty. Neighbors retreated into their homes, closing doors quickly. No one wanted to be seen near trouble. No one wanted to be associated with the condemned. Elena froze when the soldiers stopped outside her home. Her body felt weak. Her hands trembled. She did not need anyone to explain why they had come. The captain stepped forward and spoke her name. There was no accusation in his voice, no anger, no cruelty. That was somehow worse. Cruelty at least felt human. This felt mechanical, like fate itself had arrived wearing armor. She was ordered to come with them immediately. No explanation. No chance to prepare. No right to refuse. As Elena walked through the streets surrounded by guards, people stared in silence. Some pitied her. Others judged her. Many simply looked relieved it was happening to someone else. In a fearful society, survival often turns people cold. Elena expected prison. She expected public humiliation. She expected death. But instead, she was taken toward the royal palace itself. The towering gates opened slowly before her. Dark stone walls rose like mountains. Guards lined every path. Servants lowered their eyes as she passed. The palace did not feel like a home. It felt like a machine built to control everyone inside it. Elena's fear deepened. If they had brought her here, then this was bigger than punishment. Someone important had taken interest in her case. Someone powerful enough to change the normal process. She was led into a grand hall where silence hung heavier than sound. At the far end of the chamber stood a man dressed in black and gold, his posture calm, his presence overwhelming. He did not need to announce who he was. The room itself seemed shaped around his authority. Elena's breath caught in her throat. For the first time in her life, she stood before Prince Cain. And she had no idea that this moment would decide not only her survival, but the future of the empire itself. Elena stood motionless in the center of the grand hall, her pulse pounding so loudly that it almost drowned out every other sound around her. The palace chamber was vast, cold, and silent, with towering pillars stretching toward a ceiling painted with scenes of past victories and royal bloodlines. Everything about the room was designed to remind visitors of one truth: power lived here, and power did not apologize. At the far end of the hall stood Prince Cain. He did not rush to speak. He did not move toward her. He simply watched. Yet his silence felt heavier than any shouted accusation could have. Elena had imagined many things about the man people called the Lion King, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of him. He was younger than the rumors suggested, but far more intimidating. His face was sharp and unreadable, his posture perfectly controlled, and his eyes held a calm intensity that made it difficult to breathe under his gaze. Elena lowered her head instinctively. She expected someone to read charges against her. She expected guards to drag her away or priests to declare judgment. Instead, nothing happened. The silence stretched so long that it became unbearable. Finally, Cain stepped forward. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor, slow and deliberate. He stopped several feet away from her, close enough for Elena to feel the force of his presence, but far enough to maintain complete control of the space between them. "You know why you are here," he said. His voice was deep, calm, and almost emotionless. There was no cruelty in it, but no softness either. Elena swallowed hard. "Yes." Cain studied her for a moment. "Do you?" The question confused her. She lifted her eyes slightly, then lowered them again. "Because I broke the law." A faint pause followed. "No," Cain said quietly. "Because you were noticed." Those words unsettled Elena more than any threat could have. She had spent her entire life trying not to be seen. In the Empire, attention was dangerous. To be noticed by the wrong people could destroy a person long before any sentence was given. Cain turned away from her and walked toward the high windows overlooking the city below. "The council requested your execution," he said calmly. "Some demanded public punishment. Others preferred sacrifice beyond the northern border." Elena felt her knees weaken. He spoke of her death the same way others might discuss weather. Controlled. Detached. Certain. "But you are here," Cain continued, "because I denied them." Elena looked up in shock. Why would the most feared man in the Empire spare her? Cain slowly faced her again, reading the confusion on her face as if it were written plainly. "You are wondering why," he said. Elena remained silent. "You should be." His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in thought. "There are laws built on fear. And there are truths hidden beneath them. You interest me because you may be connected to both." Elena did not understand what he meant, but she understood enough to know she was not safe. A person could survive punishment. It was much harder to survive becoming important to a man like Cain. He walked closer. "You are carrying a child," he said. "Do you know the father?" The directness of the question made heat rise to her face. No. It was partly true. She had known only a name given in passing, and even that might not have been real. Cain's expression did not change. No name. No family. No claim. He spoke each word like a calculation. Then, to Elena's surprise, he said, "Good." She frowned slightly before she could stop herself. Cain noticed. "Attachment complicates decisions," he said. "This simplifies them." Elena's fear sharpened. "What decision?" Cain turned toward the guards near the doors. "Leave us." The soldiers obeyed instantly, exiting without hesitation. The giant doors closed behind them with a heavy sound that echoed through the chamber. Now they were alone. Elena's breathing became shallow. Cain returned his full attention to her. "From this moment forward, you belong under palace protection." The words should have sounded like mercy. Instead, they felt like chains. "I don't understand," Elena whispered. "You are not required to understand immediately." "That is not protection," she said before thinking. That is imprisonment. For the first time, something shifted in Kane's face. Not anger. Interest. Most people do not speak to me that way. Most people are not standing where I am. A long silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Kane gave the smallest hint of a smile. It vanished almost instantly, but Elena saw it. You are either brave, he said, or foolish. Perhaps both. He studied her for several seconds. Yes, he said at last. Perhaps. Then he delivered the words that changed everything. You will marry me. Elena stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? Kane's tone remained calm. The council cannot publicly condemn a woman under royal claim. As my wife, your status changes. Their legal path closes. Elena's thoughts scattered. Marriage? To him? This is madness, she said. This is strategy. I refuse. Kane stepped closer, and the room seemed to tighten around him. No, he said quietly. You fear. That is different from refusal. Elena's hands trembled. You cannot force this. In this empire, Kane replied, I can force many things. The honesty of it struck harder than deception would have. He did not pretend to be kind. He did not hide what power meant. Elena looked away, trying to steady herself. Why me? She asked. Kane was silent for a moment. Because your existence has already disrupted order, he said. I want to know why. That is not a reason to marry someone. It is enough reason for me. She hated how calm he remained while her world collapsed around her. What if I say no again? Kane's gaze held hers. Then the council receives you by sunrise. The threat was not loud. It did not need to be. Elena understood the choice he offered was no choice at all. Marriage or death. Protection or sacrifice. A gilded cage or an open grave. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. Kane noticed that too. You believe I am cruel, he said. You are. Perhaps. He turned away again as though the matter were already settled. The ceremony will be private. At dusk. Elena's voice shook. You are deciding my life in a single afternoon. Kane answered without looking back. No. Your empire decided it long ago. I am merely changing the method. Servants entered moments later as if they had been waiting outside for a signal. Women dressed in palace colors approached Elena carefully, avoiding direct eye contact. She stepped backward. I'm not going. Two guards moved instantly. Kane raised one hand, stopping him without turning around. Then he spoke to Elena. If I intended harm, it would already be done. Go willingly. It will be easier. She hated that some part of her believed him. The servants escorted her from the hall through endless corridors of polished stone and golden lamps. Every doorway, every staircase, every silent bow from passing staff reminded her how deeply trapped she was now. She was taken to a private chamber larger than any home she had ever seen. Silk curtains framed tall windows. Fresh clothes were laid out. A bath steamed quietly behind carved screens. Luxury is captivity. The women helped prepare her for the ceremony, but no one answered questions. No one dared speak more than necessary. As sunset approached, Elena stood before a mirror wearing garments fit for royalty. She barely recognized herself. The frightened girl from the city was gone. In her place stood a woman dressed to become the wife of the most dangerous man in the empire. When the doors opened again, guards waited to escort her. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself forward. The palace chapel was small compared to the grand hall, yet somehow colder. No guests. No celebration. Only a priest, two witnesses, armed guards, and Prince Kane standing near the altar in black ceremonial robes. He looked at her once. Long enough to unsettle her. Short enough to remain unreadable. The vows were spoken quickly. Elena's voice nearly failed when it was her turn. Kane's did not waver once. A ring was placed on her hand. The priest declared them bound under imperial authority. Just like that, her old life ended. No family beside her. No joy. No choice. When the ceremony finished, Kane stepped near enough for only her to hear. "You are safe tonight," he said. Elena met his eyes for the first time without lowering hers. "And tomorrow?" Something unreadable passed through his expression. "That," he said softly, "depends on both of us." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her surrounded by guards, silence, and the terrifying knowledge that surviving him might be harder than surviving the Empire. The night after the forced marriage, Elena did not sleep. She sat in the enormous chamber assigned to her inside the royal palace, staring at the flickering candlelight as if it might offer answers. Everything around her looked expensive, refined, and carefully designed, yet none of it felt real. The silk curtains, the carved furniture, the golden decorations, all of it only reminded her that she was no longer in control of her life. She lifted her hand slowly and looked at the ring on her finger. It was simple, not overly decorated, but its weight felt unbearable. That small object represented something she never agreed to. A bond she never chose. A life rewritten without permission. Outside her chamber, guards stood silently. Not to protect her freedom, but to ensure she did not escape it. Elena stood up and walked toward the window. From this height, the Empire looked peaceful. Lights shimmered across distant buildings, and the city appeared calm, almost beautiful. But she knew better. She had lived long enough in this world to understand that beauty in this empire was always built on fear. Somewhere inside this palace, Prince Kane was also awake. And that thought unsettled her more than anything else. She had met dangerous men before. She had seen cruelty, arrogance, and power. But Kane was different. He did not act out of emotion. He acted out of calculation. Every word he spoke felt measured. Every decision felt intentional. And the most frightening part was that he never explained himself fully. He left space for uncertainty. And uncertainty was where fear grew. The next morning, Elena was taken through the palace corridors under heavy guard. Word had already spread. Servants bowed lower than before. Conversation stopped when she passed. Some avoided looking at her entirely, while others watched her with quiet curiosity. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was now the wife of Prince Kane. And that change carried weight no one dared to ignore. Elena was brought to a private dining hall. Kane was already there. He sat at the long table alone, reading documents placed neatly in front of him. He did not look up immediately when she entered. That small detail made Elena even more aware of the imbalance between them. She stood near the entrance, unsure whether she was supposed to sit or wait. Finally, Kane spoke without lifting his eyes. "Sit." Only one word. No greeting. No acknowledgement of the marriage from the night before. Elena slowly moved and sat at the opposite side of the table. Silence followed. Servants entered quietly, placing food in front of them before quickly leaving. No one stayed longer than necessary. Elena did not touch anything. Kane finally looked up. "You are not eating," he said. "I'm not hungry." A pause. "That is not the reason." Elena frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Kane leaned back slightly, studying her with calm precision. "You are waiting for punishment," he said. The directness of it made her stiffen. "I am not." "You are," he repeated, not as an accusation, but as fact. Most people in your position expect consequences after change. Especially after what you think this marriage represents. Elena looked down. Because he was right. She did expect something worse to come. Kane watched her reaction carefully. "You misunderstand something," he said. Elena looked up again. "This marriage is not punishment," he continued. "It is containment." The word hit harder than she expected. "Containment?" she repeated. Kane nodded slightly. Your existence has created instability. The Empire reacts to instability with elimination. I react with control. Elena's hands tightened under the table. So I'm just a problem to you? Kane did not deny it immediately. You are a variable, he corrected. That sounds worse. It is more accurate. A heavy silence fell again. Elena struggled to understand him. He spoke like emotions were irrelevant, like people were systems instead of lives. After a moment, she asked quietly, "Why did you really save me?" Kane's gaze sharpened slightly. "I did not save you," he said. "I postponed your removal." "That's not an answer." "It is the only one I will give you for now." "For now." Those words lingered in Elena's mind. She watched him carefully. He was not like the cruel men she had known before. They took pleasure in fear. They enjoyed control. Kane was different. He did not enjoy it. He simply accepted it as necessary. But that made him more dangerous in a way she could not explain. Because he did not act from emotion. He acted from belief. After breakfast, Elena was escorted to another part of the palace. This time, she was not taken through public corridors. Instead, she was led through quieter, restricted hallways where fewer people walked. The atmosphere changed the deeper she went. The air felt heavier, more controlled. Eventually, she was brought to a large study room. Books lined the walls. Maps of the Empire were spread across tables. Documents were stacked in perfect order. Kane entered shortly after her. He dismissed the guards immediately. Elena noticed that instantly. "You trust them to leave?" she asked. "I trust control," he replied. She frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It does here." He walked toward the table and placed a sealed document in front of her. Elena didn't move. "What is this?" Kane looked at her. "Information." She hesitated before opening it. Inside were reports and names, locations, records of families, and something that made her stomach tighten, references to women who had disappeared under the Empire's purity law. Elena looked up sharply. "What is this?" Kane remained calm. "The system you live under," he said, "is not as stable as it appears." Elena flipped through the pages faster. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you are now inside it," he replied. She stopped. "Inside it. Not outside. Not protected. Inside." Kane stepped closer to the table. "You think you were brought here randomly," he said. "You were not." Elena's breath slowed. "What are you saying?" Kane's eyes held hers. "Your pregnancy is not the only reason you are valuable." The room felt colder. Elena's voice lowered. "What does that mean?" Kane paused slightly. Then said, "Someone inside the Empire is breaking rules that I did not authorize." Elena's mind struggled to connect it. "I don't understand." "You don't need to yet," Kane said. "That's not fair." Kane's expression remained unchanged. Fairness is not part of survival. Elena stepped back slightly. "So on what? Evidence for you?" Kane nodded once. "Yes." The word again. Evidence. Not prisoner. Not wife. Not person. Evidence. Elena felt anger rise for the first time. "You are using me," she said. Kane did not deny it. "I am observing you," he corrected. "That is the same thing." "No," he said calmly. "It is not." A tense silence followed. Elena felt trapped again, but in a different way. Not by walls, but by meaning she could not fully understand. Kane turned slightly toward the window. "Someone will eventually try to remove you," he said. "Not because of law, but because of what you represent." Elena frowned. "And what do I represent?" Kane looked at her again. "Change." That single word carried weight. Before Elena could respond, a knock came at the door. A guard entered quickly, bowing deeply. "Your Highness," he said. "The council has requested an emergency session." Kane did not react immediately. Then he said calmly, "Tell them I will attend." The guard left quickly. Silence returned. Elena looked at Kane. "Is this because of me?" Kane glanced at her. "It is because of what follows you," he said. And for the first time, Elena realized something terrifying. Her life was no longer just personal. It was political. And whatever Kane had done by marrying her had already started a chain reaction that neither of them could control anymore. The atmosphere inside the palace changed the moment Kane left for the emergency council session. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. But Elena had started learning how to feel the palace rather than simply see it. The corridors felt quieter than usual. Servants moved faster but spoke less. Guards stood in positions that felt more strategic than routine. Something was happening. And everyone knew it except her. Elena remained alone in the study room Kane had left her in. The documents still lay open on the table, their contents heavy with meaning she did not fully understand. She sat slowly, staring at them, trying to piece together a world that seemed to be shifting beneath her feet. The word Kane had used echoed in her mind. Change. She did not want to be change. She wanted safety. Silence. A return to the simple life she once had, no matter how fragile it was. But that life no longer existed. A soft knock broke her thoughts. Elena flinched slightly. The door opened, and instead of guards or servants, a woman entered. She looked older, dressed in formal palace attire, her expression calm but unreadable. There was something in her posture that suggested authority, but not open hostility. "I am Lady Marin," the woman said. Elena stayed cautious. "Why are you here?" Lady Marin studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Because you are no longer just a private matter." That statement alone made Elena uneasy. "I don't understand what that means." Lady Marin stepped further into the room, her eyes briefly scanning the documents on the table. "You are now connected to Prince Kane in a way the council cannot ignore," she said. "That makes you visible." Elena frowned. "I never asked for any of this." Lady Marin's expression softened slightly, but only for a second. "In this empire," she said, "asking is not part of survival." Those words felt too familiar. Elena looked down. "Everyone keeps saying that." "Because it is true." A pause. Then Lady Marin added, "And because you are still alive, which means something about you is already being protected." Elena looked up quickly. "Protected by who?" Lady Marin did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked toward the window and looked outside, as if measuring something beyond the palace walls. "Prince Kane does not act without reason," she finally said. "If he has placed you under his name, it is not only to shield you from the council." Elena's voice lowered. "Then why?" Lady Marin turned slightly. "Because he is waiting." "Waiting for what?" But Lady Marin only gave a small, controlled smile. "That is not a question I can answer." Before Elena could press further, footsteps echoed outside. Lady Marin immediately straightened, her expression returning to formal neutrality. The door opened again. A guard entered. "The council session is escalating," he said. "All senior members are requesting Prince Kane's immediate return." Lady Marin nodded once and left without another word. Elena was alone again. But this time, the silence felt heavier. Meanwhile, deep inside the Imperial Council chamber, the tension had already reached a breaking point. The room was vast, circular, and built from dark stone that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. High-ranking officials sat in structured positions around a central table. Each of them represented a faction within the empire: lawmakers, military leaders, and noble advisors. And at the center of their discussion stood Prince Kane. He was calm. Too calm. One of the council elders spoke sharply. "You have crossed a line that cannot be ignored, Prince Kane." Kane did not respond immediately. His gaze remained steady, unreadable. Another voice followed. You have taken a woman under imperial restriction and declared her under your protection without authorization. Kane finally spoke. Authorization is not required for what I have already secured. The council stirred. This is not your personal domain, another official said firmly. You are bound by imperial law. Kane's expression remained unchanged. Law is maintained by structure, he said. And structure is maintained by authority. A silence followed. Then a senior council member leaned forward. You are risking civil imbalance over a single individual. Kane tilted his head slightly. She is not the imbalance, he said. She is the reason it is visible. That statement made several officials exchange uneasy glances. One of them spoke more carefully. The woman is carrying an illegitimate condition. The purity law is clear. Kane interrupted immediately. The purity law is outdated control disguised as morality. The room went still. No one spoke for a moment. Then the council leader's voice hardened. You are challenging the foundation of the empire itself. Kane's eyes finally narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. If the foundation cannot withstand truth, he said, then it was never stable. Tension rose instantly. This is rebellion, someone muttered. Kane turned his gaze slowly across the council. No, he said calmly. This is correction. That word changed the atmosphere completely. Correction implied authority above law. Correction implied judgment over the system itself. One of the elders stood slightly. Then you leave us no choice. Kane looked at him directly. You never had a choice, he replied. The council erupted in murmurs. But Kane raised one hand slightly. And the room fell silent again. Not because they agreed. Because they feared the consequence of interrupting him. I will repeat this once, Kane said. His voice remained controlled, but it carried weight now. She remains under my jurisdiction. Any action against her will be considered direct opposition to the throne's authority. A council member stood abruptly. You cannot place yourself above the empire. Kane's gaze locked onto him. I am not above it, he said. I am what keeps it from collapsing. That sentence hit harder than any threat. For a moment, no one responded. Because deep down, many of them understood something they did not want to admit. Kane was not speaking like a man defending himself. He was speaking like someone who already knew how this system worked and how easily it could break. Back in the palace study, Elena remained unaware of the full argument unfolding in the council. But she could feel the pressure building in the air. The palace was reacting. Not calmly. Not quietly. Something was shifting. She stood and walked toward the window again. Outside, the empire looked unchanged. People moved through streets, guards patrolled gates, life continued as if nothing was wrong. But Elena knew better now. Nothing in this world stayed still for long. A knock interrupted her thoughts again. This time, it was not gentle. 2 guards entered. Elena, one of them said formally. You are to be escorted. Her heart tightened. Where? They did not answer immediately. That silence told her everything she needed to know. No, she said instinctively, stepping back. The guards moved forward. Elena, this is not optional. Her breathing quickened. Where's Kane? She asked quickly. No answer. One of the guards reached for her arm. And at that exact moment, a deep voice cut through the room from behind them. Release her. The guards froze instantly. Elena turned sharply. Prince Kane stood at the entrance. His presence filled the room immediately, heavy and controlled. The guards stepped back at once. Kane walked forward slowly, his eyes fixed on the situation without urgency. Leave, he said once more. The guards obeyed and exited quickly. Silence returned. Elena's chest rose and fell as she tried to steady herself. Kane looked at her for a moment. You were not supposed to be moved, he said calmly. Her voice shook slightly. They didn't tell me where I was going. I know. That answer unsettled her. Kane stepped closer, stopping just in front of her. For a moment, he simply studied her. Then he said, quietly, "The council is testing limits." Elena swallowed. Testing what? Kane's expression darkened slightly. Me. A pause. Then he added, "And you." Those two words made her stomach tighten. Kane turned slightly toward the door. They are preparing something, he said. And it will not remain political for long. Elena felt a chill. What happens now? Kane looked at her again. And for the first time, there was something in his eyes she could not fully interpret. Not emotion. Not hesitation. Something closer to anticipation. Now, he said quietly, we wait for the Empire to make its move. And with that, Elena finally understood. The real conflict had already begun. And she was standing in the center of it. The silence after the council's final warning did not end when Elena left the hall. It followed her like a shadow, heavy and suffocating, as if the very air inside the palace had changed its weight. Every step she took back through the long corridors felt slower than before, not because she was physically weak, but because her mind was no longer able to separate reality from fear. The words still echoed in her thoughts. They are preparing to remove the problem entirely. Elena knew what that meant, even if no one had explained it in detail. In this empire, removal was never a soft action. It was clean, absolute, and final. There was no second chance once the system decided you no longer belonged inside it. But what terrified her most was not just the council's decision. It was Kane's reaction, or rather, the lack of it. He had not denied the possibility of danger. He had not reassured her. Instead, he had spoken like someone already planning 10 steps ahead of an approaching war. And that was exactly what it felt like now. A war was coming. Not just against her, but around her. That night, Elena could not sleep. The palace, usually silent in a controlled and structured way, now felt different. There were movements in the distance, faint sounds of footsteps that did not belong to servants. Doors opened and closed more frequently than usual. Guards changed positions without explanation. It was not chaos yet. It was preparation. She sat near the edge of her bed, staring at the dark window where the Empire's distant lights flickered like dying stars. For the first time since arriving in the palace, she felt truly alone, not physically, but emotionally abandoned in a system she could not understand. Then she heard it. A knock. Soft, controlled, deliberate. Elena froze. No one came to her chamber at this hour unless it was important. Or dangerous. She stood slowly, every instinct warning her not to move too quickly. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice barely steady. No answer. Then the door opened anyway. Prince Kane stepped inside. He did not announce himself. He never needed to. Elena's breath tightened immediately, not out of surprise anymore, but out of instinctive awareness. His presence always changed the room. The air felt denser when he entered, as if even silence adjusted itself around him. He closed the door behind him without looking at her. "You were not sleeping," he said calmly. It was not a question. Elena hesitated. "I can't." Kane's gaze shifted toward her for the first time. Not sharp, not cold, just observant. Because of the council. It was not a guess. It was a confirmation. Elena swallowed. "They're going to kill me, aren't they?" The question hung in the air longer than she expected. Kane did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the window, looking outside at the Empire beyond the palace walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "They are going to try." That distinction mattered. Elena's hands tightened slightly. "What's the difference?" Kane turned slightly, just enough for his gaze to meet hers. "Failure." A pause followed. Then he added, "And resistance." Elena didn't fully understand what he meant, but something in his tone made her chest tighten further. Kane was not speaking like a man reacting to a threat. He was speaking like someone who had already accepted it and was preparing to respond in kind. "You challenged them," she said carefully. "Now they'll come after you too." Kane's expression did not change. "They were always going to." That answer silenced her. It wasn't about her. It had never been just about her. She was only the trigger. A reason for something much larger that had been waiting beneath the surface for a long time. Kane took a slow step forward. "Do you know why they fear you?" Elena frowned slightly. "Because of what I am." "No," Kane replied instantly. "Because of what you represent." That sentence unsettled her more than anything else he had said so far. "I don't represent anything," she said. Kane studied her for a moment, as if deciding whether to explain or let her remain in ignorance. Finally, he spoke. "You represent a flaw in their system. Something they cannot classify. And anything unclassified becomes dangerous to control." Elena felt a cold realization settle in her chest. She wasn't being targeted because she had done something wrong. She was being targeted because she existed outside their rules. Outside the chamber, distant bells rang once. Not alarms, but signals. A structured warning system used only in rare situations. Kane did not react to it immediately. But Elena did. Her body stiffened. What was that? Kane's gaze shifted briefly toward the door. "It has begun." Her heart dropped instantly. "What has begun?" He turned fully toward her now. "The Empire has made its first move." For a moment, everything felt unreal. Elena stared at him, waiting for clarification, for correction, for anything that would make this less final. But Kane did not soften his words. "They are mobilizing internal authority," he continued. "Council-backed enforcement. They will attempt to isolate you first. Then remove you." Elena's voice shook slightly. "And you?" Kane paused. That pause mattered. Then he said, "I will respond accordingly." It wasn't comfort. It was strategy. Elena stepped back slightly. "You're talking like this is already a battle." Kane's eyes darkened slightly, not with anger, but with focus. "It is." A heavy silence followed. Elena tried to process everything at once, but it felt too large, too fast, too far beyond her control. She had entered this palace as a hidden consequence of a forbidden truth. Now she was standing at the center of a political fracture that threatened the entire empire. And Kane, he was not stepping away from it. He was stepping into it. "You could still give me to them," she said quietly, almost desperately. "End this before it gets worse." For the first time, something subtle shifted in Kane's expression. Not sympathy. Not softness. But certainty. "I could," he said. Then he added, "But I won't." The words were simple. Final. Unchangeable. Elena felt something inside her tighten, not relief, not safety, but something closer to inevitability. Kane was no longer treating her as a variable. He was treating her as a boundary. A line that the Empire would have to cross through him. And that meant there was no neutral outcome anymore. Only sides. Kane turned slightly toward the door again. "From this moment forward, your movement will be restricted for your protection." Elena frowned. "So I'm still a prisoner." Kane corrected her immediately. "You are not a prisoner." A pause. "You are a priority." Before Elena could respond, Kane moved toward the door. But just before leaving, he stopped. Without turning back, he said one final line. "Do not trust silence from this point forward. It will not mean safety." And then he left. The door closed behind him softly. But the meaning of his words stayed behind louder than anything else in the room. Elena stood alone again. But this time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt like something waiting. Something that had already started moving. And far beyond the palace walls, the empire began preparing for what it believed would be a correction. But what it would become was a war. The first wave of conflict. The morning after Kane's warning did not feel like a morning at all. There was no sense of calm, no natural rhythm of a new day beginning. Instead, the palace felt suspended, like everything inside it was holding its breath, waiting for something invisible to arrive. Elena noticed it immediately. The servants moved faster but spoke less. Guards no longer stood in relaxed positions, they were alert, rigid, and constantly scanning their surroundings. Even the corridors, once simply cold and quiet, now felt like structured pathways of surveillance. Something had changed. And everyone knew it. Even if no one said it out loud. Elena was not allowed to leave her chamber that morning. 2 guards stood outside her door, not as protectors in the usual sense, but as silent boundaries. She could feel it in their posture. They were not guarding her from escape. They were guarding her from exposure. Inside the room, she paced slowly, trying to calm her thoughts. But every attempt to think logically only made the situation feel worse. The Empire was moving against her. Kane had made his position clear. And now she was caught in the middle of something she could not influence or escape. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts again. This time, it was not Kane. A servant entered cautiously, avoiding eye contact. "You are requested to remain inside until further notice." Elena frowned. "By who?" The servant hesitated. Then answered carefully, "By Prince Kane's direct order." And just like that, her limited sense of freedom tightened again. Time passed in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the tense, stretched silence of anticipation. Hours felt longer than they should have. Every distant sound outside the chamber made Elena's heart tighten slightly. Then, around midday, something shifted. A deep horn echoed through the palace. Not ceremonial. Not routine. It was an alert. Elena rushed to the window. And what she saw made her breath stop. Beyond the palace gates, movement. Not chaotic movement, but organized formations. Imperial guards. Official enforcers of the council. Hundreds of them. Arriving. Her hands went cold. "They're here," she whispered to herself. For a moment, everything inside her went still. This was no longer a hidden political tension. This was visible. Real. Physical. The Empire had arrived at Kane's doorstep. And they were not coming to negotiate. The palace reacted instantly. Doors closed across different wings. Guards repositioned themselves in coordinated silence. The entire structure shifted into a defensive state so smooth it felt rehearsed. Elena had never seen anything like it. It was not panic. It was readiness. Then she heard footsteps outside her chamber again. Stronger. More controlled. The door opened. Kane entered. He looked exactly as he always did. Calm. Unshaken. Controlled. But there was something different now. Not in his expression, but in his presence. It felt sharper, like a blade that had finally been drawn. He did not look at her immediately. Instead, he walked to the center of the room and spoke without preamble. "They've crossed the outer boundary." Elena's voice came out quietly. "What does that mean?" Kane turned slightly toward her. "It means they are no longer observing." A pause. "They are enforcing." Elena felt her stomach tighten. "So it's war?" Kane didn't answer immediately. That silence alone confirmed too much. Then he said, "Not yet." That single word carried weight. Not yet meant it was already in motion. Just not fully visible. Elena stepped closer. "What do they want from me?" Kane finally looked at her fully. This time, his gaze was different. Not detached. Not analytical. Focused. "They want to erase what they cannot regulate," he said. Her breath slowed slightly. "And you?" Cain paused. Then answered, I intend to prevent that. It was not emotional. It was absolute. A loud sound echoed outside the palace walls. Metal against metal. The first clash. Elena flinched instinctively. Cain did not. Instead, he turned toward the door again. Stay inside this chamber. Do not open it for anyone except me. Elena's voice sharpened slightly. And if you don't come back? Cain stopped. A rare pause. Then he answered without turning around. Then you will already know what has happened. And he left. The door closed. But the world outside had already begun collapsing into motion. Elena rushed back to the window. Now she could clearly see it. The Imperial forces were no longer waiting outside the gates. They were pushing forward. And Cain's forces had met them halfway. Steel. Movement. Precision. Not chaos, but controlled destruction. Elena pressed her hand against the cold glass. For the first time, she truly understood. This was not about her pregnancy anymore. It was not even about the Empire's law. It had become something larger. A test of authority itself. Cain stood at the center of it. And because of that, she was now the reason everything was burning. Inside the battlefield outside the palace gates, Cain moved differently than she had ever seen before. Not rushed. Not aggressive. But precise. Every command he gave shifted the direction of the conflict. Every step he took altered the balance of power in real time. His presence alone changed how the Imperial forces reacted. They did not fight like enemies facing a ruler. They fought like men confronting something they had been told should not exist. Inside the palace, Elena could only hear fragments. Clashes in the distance. Shouted commands. Then silence. Then movement again. It was unpredictable. Unstable. And terrifying. Hours passed like that. Elena stopped pacing. Stopped thinking. She simply listened. Every sound outside felt like a signal. Every silence felt worse than noise. Then suddenly, everything stopped. Complete silence. Elena froze. Her breath caught. This was not normal. No movement. No sound. No distant conflict. Just emptiness. She stepped closer to the door instinctively. Cain, she called out. No answer. Her heart began to race. She reached for the handle. Then stopped. His order echoed in her mind. Do not open it for anyone except me. The silence continued. Too long. Too unnatural. Elena's hands trembled slightly. Then, footsteps. Slow. Approaching. She stepped back immediately. The door remained closed. A shadow appeared under it. Then stopped. A voice followed. But it was not Cain's. It was unfamiliar. Cold. Controlled. We know she is inside. Elena froze completely. Outside the chamber, the palace was no longer safe. And inside it, Elena realized something terrifying. The first wave of conflict had not just reached the palace. It had reached her door. The door under siege. The voice outside the door did not repeat itself. It didn't need to. The silence that followed carried more pressure than any threat spoken aloud. Elena stood frozen in the center of the chamber, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. We know she is inside. Not if. Not maybe. They knew. Her pulse began to rise again, sharp and uncontrollable. The palace, which had once felt like a controlled fortress under Cain's authority, now felt exposed. Vulnerable. And for the first time since everything began, Elena understood something clearly. Cain was not the only one who had been watching her. Outside the door, footsteps shifted. Multiple people. Not one. Not two. A group. Elena backed away slowly, instinctively moving toward the far side of the room where she could keep the door in view. Her hands clenched tightly, though she wasn't even aware of it. Another voice spoke outside. "Open the chamber. We have authority from the Imperial Council." Authority. That word again. The same word that had followed her life like a chain since the beginning. Elena swallowed hard. "I'm not opening anything," she whispered to herself, even though no one could hear her. But her voice felt weak in the empty room. Outside, there was a brief pause. Then, a sharp knock. Not aggressive. Controlled. But final. "Elena of the palace," the voice continued. "You are ordered to step outside." Her name. Hearing it like that made something inside her tighten. Not as a person, but as a target. Elena's breathing became shallow. She looked around the room as if searching for another exit, but there was none. The chamber had no second door, no hidden escape. It was designed to be secure, not flexible. A containment space. Just like Cain had said before. Control. Another knock came. This one louder. "I will not repeat the order." Elena took a step back. Then another. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. And then, a sound from the palace outside. A distant explosion. The ground beneath her felt like it shifted slightly. She froze. Something was breaking through. And then, silence again. But this time, it was different. Heavier. Closer. As if the world itself had paused to decide what would happen next. The door suddenly shook. Not from a knock. From impact. Elena stepped back immediately. Her breath caught in her throat. Another impact. Stronger. The frame of the door creaked slightly. "They're trying to break in," she whispered. Her body moved on instinct now, retreating until her back hit the wall. There was nowhere else to go. The Empire had stopped waiting. Another strike hit the door. Then another. The sound of metal reinforcement groaning filled the room. Elena closed her eyes briefly. And in that moment, a memory flashed through her mind. Cain's voice. "Do not open it for anyone except me." Her eyes snapped open again. "Where are you?" she whispered under her breath. Outside, the attackers changed tactics. The knocking stopped. Instead, there was a faint sound of tools. They were forcing the lock. Slowly. Precisely. Like they had done this before. Elena's hands trembled. Her mind raced through possibilities, but none of them ended safely. If they entered, she had no protection. No authority. No voice. She was no longer hidden. She was exposed. Then, a new sound. Louder. Closer. Footsteps running through the palace corridor. Multiple. Fast. Not the Imperial Guards. Different rhythm. Controlled urgency. Elena turned toward the door again, her breath caught mid-motion. The attacking sounds outside paused. As if both sides had noticed the same thing. Then a voice echoed through the corridor. Cold. Commanding. "Step away from that door." It wasn't from the Imperial side. Elena's heart jolted. She recognized that voice. Even before she fully understood it. A sharp clash followed. Metal against metal. Fighting had broken out directly outside her chamber now. The door vibrated slightly from the impact nearby. Elena pressed herself against the wall, her mind overwhelmed by noise and confusion. Then, a final voice cut through everything. Calm. Controlled. Absolute. You have entered restricted territory without authorization. A pause. Then. Leave. Elena's breath caught. Kane. It was Kane. The fight outside intensified instantly. More clashes. More movement. But this time, the sound shifted. The Imperial force was no longer advancing with confidence. They were reacting. Being pushed back. Elena slowly moved closer to the door again, her fear mixing with something else now. Hope. Uncertainty. Disbelief. A loud impact hit the corridor outside. Then silence followed immediately after. Too sudden. Too clean. The handle of her door finally moved. Elena stepped back instinctively. The door opened. Kane stood there. He was not injured. Not shaken. Not even out of breath. But his presence was heavier than before. Controlled intensity filled the space around him, like a storm contained inside a single figure. His gaze immediately locked onto Elena. She didn't speak. Neither did he. For a moment, the chaos outside felt distant again. Then Kane spoke. You are not to leave this room under any circumstance. His voice was calm. But final. Elena swallowed. They were inside already. I know, he interrupted. A pause. Then he added, they will not return. Elena stared at him. You pushed them back? Kane didn't answer directly. Instead, he stepped slightly inside the room and closed the door behind him. The sound of the outside conflict became muted again. Contained. Controlled. It is no longer a simple enforcement operation, Kane said quietly. Elena frowned slightly. What does that mean? Kane looked at her for a moment before replying. It means the Empire has escalated its response. A pause. And now, they will send more than soldiers. Elena felt a cold sensation run through her. Then what are they sending? Kane's expression remained unchanged. But his voice lowered slightly. Judgment-level authority. Elena didn't fully understand the term, but she understood the tone behind it. This was not a warning. It was a stage change. A shift in scale. Kane turned slightly toward the window. Outside, distant flashes of conflict still flickered. But they were fading. Not because the war had ended, but because something larger was replacing it. Kane spoke again, quieter this time. They are no longer trying to remove you. Elena's breath slowed. What are they trying to do then? Kane's gaze sharpened slightly. They are trying to decide what you are. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Unfinished. Dangerous. And for the first time, Elena realized the truth of what was happening. She was no longer just a person inside a conflict. She had become a question the Empire itself was trying to answer. And whatever answer they chose would decide everything that came next. The judgment begins. The palace did not sleep that night. Even after Kane returned to his position inside the chamber, the sense of unrest never fully disappeared. It had only changed shape. The fighting outside had reduced, but it had not ended. Instead, it had shifted into something more controlled, more calculated, like both sides were no longer rushing, but preparing for a final, decisive move. Elena stayed inside the chamber as ordered, sitting near the edge of the bed, her thoughts restless. Every sound outside the walls now carried meaning. Every distant movement felt like a signal she could not interpret properly. The Empire was no longer acting like it was hunting one person. It was acting like it was preparing to redefine something. And at the center of that uncertainty stood Kane. He did not leave her side that night. Not physically close all the time, but present in the space like a constant weight. Sometimes he stood near the window, watching the outside movements. Sometimes he simply remained silent in the room, as if thinking through possibilities only he could see. Elena finally broke the silence after what felt like hours. Why are they doing this? She asked quietly. Kane did not turn immediately. Because they cannot accept uncertainty. Her gaze lifted slightly. I'm not uncertainty. This time, he turned toward her. No, he said. You are the source of it. That answer made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't explain. It didn't reduce her to a mistake or a crime, it placed her outside the system entirely, as something that disrupted the way the system defined reality itself. Outside, another distant sound echoed through the palace grounds. Not an explosion this time. More controlled. More formal. Kane noticed it immediately. They've deployed observers, he said calmly. Elena frowned. Observers? Kane stepped slightly closer to the window. Not soldiers. Analysts. Those who don't fight, but decide. That word, decide, felt heavier than anything else she had heard that day. Elena stood slowly. Decide what? Kane's expression remained steady. Whether this situation becomes an exception or a correction. A pause followed. And what I am allowed to do about it. Elena felt her stomach tighten. So now it's not just about me being alive or dead. Kane looked at her briefly. It was never only about that. The way he said it made her realize something uncomfortable. From the very beginning, she had thought she was the center of this conflict. But she was not. She was the trigger. The Empire was reacting to what she represented, not just who she was. The night deepened further, but no one in the palace relaxed. Instead, the structure itself seemed to adjust. Guards changed positions again. Corridors were sealed in certain areas. Doors that were once accessible became restricted. Elena noticed how quickly everything adapted. Like the palace itself was recalculating. And Kane, he was at the center of that recalculation. At some point, Kane finally spoke again. They will send a delegation by morning. Elena looked at him sharply. To do what? Kane's gaze stayed fixed ahead. To evaluate directly. The words were simple, but their meaning wasn't. Elena felt a quiet fear rise in her chest. Evaluate me, or you? Kane paused for a moment. Both, he said. The morning arrived without light. Not literally, but emotionally. The palace remained in a state of controlled tension, as if time itself had slowed down to make room for what was coming. When the delegation arrived, Elena was not informed immediately. She only knew something had changed when Kane left the chamber without explanation, accompanied by guards who were not part of the palace's usual structure. That alone told her enough. This was not internal anymore. It was imperial-level intervention. Hours passed in silence again. Elena stayed in her room, but her mind was far from still. She imagined corridors filled with officials she had never met, discussions happening without her presence, decisions forming around her existence like walls closing in from all sides. And Kane was there. Always there. Always deciding something. Finally, the door opened again. But this time, it wasn't Kane alone. 2 guards entered first. Then Kane followed. And behind him, 3 figures Elena had never seen before. They wore formal imperial insignia. Their presence alone changed the atmosphere of the room. Kane spoke first. They are here to observe directly. One of the officials stepped forward slightly. We are here to confirm classification status. Elena's body stiffened. Classification? The man's eyes moved toward her, not unkindly, but not humanely either. Your condition, he said simply. And its implications. Elena felt a cold realization settle in. They weren't here to judge her as a person. They were here to categorize her existence. Kane stepped slightly to the side, but his presence remained dominant in the room. You will not interfere beyond observation, he said calmly. One of the officials replied, that depends on what we find. A brief silence followed. Tension tightened in the room again. Elena stood still, caught between them. For the first time, she realized how small her role actually was in their world. Not powerless, but unclassified. and in a system built entirely on classification that made her more dangerous than anything else. One of the officials turned toward Kane. "You have protected her beyond permitted boundaries." Kane did not deny it. "I have acted within necessity," he replied. The official narrowed his gaze slightly. "Necessity is not a legal category." Kane's voice remained calm. "It is when authority defines it." The room fell silent again. Elena looked between them, realizing the conversation was no longer about her alone. It was about who had the right to define reality inside this empire. And Kane was no longer just defending her. He was challenging the structure itself. One of the officials finally turned toward Elena. "Step forward." Elena hesitated. Kane's gaze shifted slightly toward her, not commanding, but steady. She moved forward slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. When she stopped in front of them, the official studied her carefully. Not like a person. Like a case. A deviation. An anomaly. Then he spoke. "Her condition does not match known imperial cases." Another official responded immediately. "Then it must be resolved." Elena's breath caught slightly. Resolved. That word again. Kane stepped forward. "No," he said calmly. The officials looked at him. "This is not subject to immediate resolution," he continued. "It is subject to understanding." A pause followed. The tension in the room sharpened again. The lead official narrowed his eyes. "Understanding is not required for correction." Kane met his gaze directly. "In my domain, it is." Silence. Absolute. Elena stood in the middle of it all, realizing something terrifying. This was no longer just a conflict between her and the Empire. It was a conflict between Kane's authority and the Empire's system itself. And she was the reason it was happening. The official finally spoke again. "Then this will proceed to higher judgment." Kane did not react immediately. But something in his expression shifted slightly. Not fear. Not surprise. But recognition. As if he had been expecting this moment all along. And in that instant, Elena understood the truth. This was not the end of evaluation. It was the beginning of judgment. And whatever came next would no longer remain inside the palace walls. The breaking point of authority. The moment the phrase higher judgment was spoken, the entire atmosphere inside the chamber changed again. It was subtle at first, like a shift in pressure in the air, but everyone felt it. Even the guards outside the door seemed to straighten instinctively, as if the words themselves had weight in this empire. Elena stood completely still. She didn't fully understand what higher judgment meant in official terms, but she understood enough to know it was not routine. It was not local authority anymore. It was escalation beyond the palace, beyond Kane's immediate control, and possibly beyond anything she had faced so far. Kane, however, did not react with surprise. He only exhaled slowly, barely noticeable, like someone confirming a prediction they had already calculated long ago. The lead official stepped forward slightly. By imperial statute, anomalies of unclassified biological and legal status must be transferred to central judgment authority. Elena's chest tightened instantly. "Transferred?" she repeated quietly. The word sounded worse than everything else combined. It did not mean protection. It did not mean evaluation. It meant removal from this place entirely. Kane turned his head slightly toward the official. Central authority does not override direct jurisdiction during active containment. The official's expression hardened. "You are redefining containment beyond allowed parameters." Kane's voice remained calm. "I am maintaining stability." A short silence followed. Then another official spoke, more cautious but firm. "Stability cannot be maintained through personal discretion, Prince Kane." That sentence lingered in the air like a challenge. Elena felt it immediately. This was no longer just about her existence. It was about whether Kane's authority inside his own domain was still accepted by the Empire. Cain finally turned fully toward them. For the first time, there was something sharper in his presence. Not anger. Not emotion. But finality. Then the Empire must decide, he said, whether it still recognizes its own structure. The room went still again. Even Elena felt it. That was not a defensive statement. It was a fracture line being drawn. The lead official narrowed his eyes. You are speaking as if you stand outside the Empire. Cain's gaze did not shift. I am speaking as someone who understands its limits. A pause followed. Then Cain added something quieter, but far more dangerous. And I have reached one. Elena's breath caught. For the first time, she realized Cain was not just resisting the council's decision. He was openly acknowledging a boundary between his authority and the Empire's authority. And he was standing on it. The official stepped back slightly, exchanging a brief glance with the others. Then he spoke again. Then this matter will escalate to sovereign arbitration. That phrase changed everything. Elena didn't know all the formal structures of the Empire, but she understood hierarchy. Sovereign arbitration meant one thing: the highest level of imperial decision-making. Not debate. Not negotiation. Final ruling. Cain closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second. When he opened them again, his expression was even more controlled than before. I expected this outcome, he said. Elena turned toward him quickly. You did? Cain didn't look at her yet. Yes. A pause. Then he finally met her eyes. But not this early. That answer unsettled her more than anything else. You knew this would happen? She asked. Cain's voice lowered slightly. The moment they classified you as unresolvable, escalation was inevitable. Elena felt her stomach drop. Then why did you protect me? Cain paused again. And this time, his answer came slower. Because removal is not resolution. A heavy silence followed. The officials seemed to be preparing to leave, but no one moved yet. The tension in the room was still unresolved, like a balance waiting to collapse. Then one of them spoke again. The Sovereign Council will arrive within 72 hours. He looked directly at Cain. You are required to present justification for your interference. Cain nodded once. I will. No hesitation. No resistance. Just certainty. The officials turned to leave. But before exiting, the lead official glanced once at Elena. Not with sympathy. Not with hostility. But with assessment. Then he said something that lingered long after he left. Your existence is no longer a private matter. And then the door closed. Silence returned to the chamber. But it was different now. Heavier. Finalier. Elena slowly turned toward Cain. What does that mean? Cain didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the window again, looking outside at the Empire beyond the palace walls. Finally, he spoke. It means you are no longer inside a dispute. A pause. You are inside a verdict process. Elena felt her throat tighten. And you? Cain's gaze remained fixed outside. I am part of that process now. She stepped closer. That sounds like you're not in control anymore. For the first time, Cain turned toward her fully. And his answer was quiet. I am in control of what I can influence. A pause. The rest is now conflict. That word stayed in the air longer than anything else. Conflict. Not negotiation. Not politics. Conflict. Elena slowly sat down, overwhelmed by the scale of everything she was hearing. So what happens now? Cain didn't respond immediately. Then he said, Now, they prepare to judge not just you, but my authority. That sentence made Elena go still. For the first time, she understood the real danger. It was no longer about whether she lived or died. It was about whether Kane's rule inside his own territory would be accepted or challenged at the highest level. And if it was challenged, everything would collapse into something neither of them could control. Kane finally turned slightly toward her again. His voice lowered, but remained steady. "You are no longer the center of the situation," he said. A pause. "You are the reason it cannot be contained." Elena looked at him, her mind struggling to keep up. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said quietly. Kane's gaze held hers for a long moment. "I know." Then, after a pause, "That is exactly why they are afraid of you." Outside, somewhere in the Empire, preparations for sovereign judgment had already begun. And inside the palace, for the first time, Kane was no longer simply protecting Elena. He was preparing for a confrontation with the Empire itself. The weight of sovereign judgment. The announcement of sovereign arbitration changed everything without needing to physically change anything. The palace still looked the same on the surface: tall walls, silent corridors, disciplined guards, but the feeling inside it had shifted into something far more serious. It was no longer just a controlled political environment. It had become a waiting ground for judgment at the highest level of the Empire. Elena could feel it in every breath she took. Even the silence now felt official. Kane had not left her side since the officials departed. He stood near the center of the chamber, unmoving, as if already processing a battle that had not yet physically begun. His presence was the only constant in a situation that was rapidly becoming unstable. Elena finally broke the silence. "What happens in sovereign arbitration?" Kane didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed forward, as if the question was something he had already considered long before she asked it. Then he spoke. "It is where the Empire stops debating and starts deciding." Elena frowned slightly. "Deciding what?" Kane turned his head slightly toward her. "Whether authority is valid," he said, "or replaced." That answer made her stomach tighten. Elena took a slow breath. "And if they decide against you?" Kane didn't react emotionally. But there was a pause. A very small one. Then he said, "Then my jurisdiction ends." The words landed heavily in the room. Elena looked at him more carefully now. "And what happens to me?" Kane met her gaze directly. "That depends on what they classify you as," he said. A pause. "Either erased or extracted." The word erased made her freeze internally. She didn't ask what extracted meant. She already understood enough to be afraid of both options. Elena lowered her gaze slightly. "So I'm not even part of the decision." Kane's voice remained steady. "You are the reason for the decision." That distinction felt colder than anything else. "Not included." "But central." A distant sound echoed through the palace walls again. "Not fighting this time." "Not movement." "More like structured arrivals." "Controlled presence." Kane turned slightly toward the sound. "They are already moving their representatives closer," he said. Elena looked up. "Already?" Kane nodded once. "Sovereign processes are not delayed by distance," he replied. "Only prepared for." Hours passed in slow silence after that. Elena noticed Kane leaving the chamber once, speaking briefly with palace commanders, then returning without explanation. Every movement he made now felt like part of a larger structure she could not fully see. She realized something unsettling. Kane was not reacting to the situation anymore. He was preparing for it. As if the outcome had already split into possible paths in his mind, and he was already building responses for each one. Later that evening, Kane finally spoke again. "They will arrive within 1 day." Elena looked up. "And then what?" Kane turned slightly toward her. "Then everything that has been hidden will be placed under direct review." A pause. "And nothing inside this palace will remain private." Elena felt a strange coldness spread through her chest. "Even me?" Kane's gaze stayed steady. "Especially you." That answer stayed in the air longer than anything else. Elena slowly stood. "So my entire life becomes a case file?" Kane didn't deny it. It already is, he said. Elena's voice softened slightly. And you're still protecting me, even knowing that? Kane looked at her for a long moment before answering. I am not protecting you, he said finally. A pause. I am controlling what happens until judgment arrives. That sentence made her stop. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't reassurance. It was structure. Elena looked away for a moment, trying to process everything. And after judgment? Kane's answer came slower this time. After judgment, he said, the Empire decides whether I am still allowed to exist in my position. That made her look back at him immediately. You're saying they could remove you too? Kane didn't hesitate. Yes. Silence followed again. This time, it was heavier than before. Elena suddenly realized the full scale of what was happening. This was no longer about her survival alone. It was about Kane's authority. His position. His existence within the Empire's structure. And she was at the center of the case that could end all of it. Elena stepped slightly closer. Then why not give me up? If I'm the reason all of this is happening. Kane interrupted immediately. You are not the reason. A pause. You are the trigger they chose to act upon. That distinction was important. But it didn't make her feel safer. It made everything feel more deliberate. Elena lowered her voice. Do you think they will decide against you? Kane didn't answer immediately. For the first time, he looked away and not from her, but toward the distant window, as if seeing something beyond the palace entirely. Then he said, they will not decide based on truth. A pause. They will decide based on control. Elena felt a quiet realization settle in. So this isn't about justice. Kane's answer was immediate. No. Another pause. It is about who defines justice. The room fell silent again. But this silence felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. Kane finally turned back toward her. His voice lowered slightly. When sovereign judgment begins, he said, you will not be seen as a person. Elena looked at him carefully. What will I be seen as? Kane held her gaze. Evidence. That word returned again. But this time, it felt final. Not theoretical. Not symbolic. Real. Elena swallowed slightly. And you? Kane paused for a moment. Then answered quietly. I will be seen as deviation. A pause. And deviation is always removed or rewritten. For the first time, Elena understood the true scale of danger they were facing. It was no longer internal palace conflict. No longer council disagreement. It was systemic correction at the highest level. And she was standing inside it. Kane took a slow step toward the window again. Outside, the Empire was no longer silent. Something larger was moving closer. And inside the palace, the final countdown had already begun. The breaking point of power and truth. The atmosphere inside the palace had reached a point where silence no longer meant peace. It now meant tension, control, and the heavy weight of decisions that could no longer be delayed. Elena stood in the center of this unstable world, fully aware that everything around her was shifting toward something irreversible. The Empire was no longer quietly observing her existence, it was actively preparing to respond to it. And Prince Kane, the man who had placed himself between her and the law, was now standing at the center of a storm that could either crown him as a ruler beyond the Empire, or destroy everything he had built. Kane had always been calm, unreadable, and controlled, but even he could not ignore what was coming. Messages from the council had become sharper, demands more direct, and political pressure had increased from every direction. The Empire was no longer willing to tolerate uncertainty. For them, Elena was not a person anymore. She was a problem that needed to be removed. But Kane's response remained unchanged. He did not bend. He did not negotiate. He simply waited, as if he was already 2 steps ahead of everyone else. Elena, however, was no longer the same woman who had once lived in fear. Everything she had experienced inside the palace had changed her understanding of power, truth, and survival. She had learned that fear was not always weakness, it was awareness. And Cain, despite his cold nature, was not simply a monster as the Empire had described him. He was something more complicated. Something human, buried beneath control and responsibility. One evening, Cain summoned her to the highest chamber of the palace. The room was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt final. There were no guards this time. No council members. Only the two of them. Elena stepped inside slowly, already sensing that this was not an ordinary meeting. Cain stood near the window, looking out at the empire that had shaped him into what he had become. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, without turning, he spoke. "They have made their decision," he said calmly. Elena's heart tightened. "And what is their decision?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Cain turned slowly, his expression steady but deeper than usual. "They want war," he replied. The words hung in the air like a final judgment. Elena felt her breath become uneven. This was no longer about her alone. This was about the empire itself breaking against its own ruler. She looked at Cain, searching for hesitation, fear, or doubt, but there was none. Only clarity. For the first time, Cain stepped closer to her without control or calculation. There was something different in his gaze now. Not possession. Not observation. But choice. A choice that had been building inside him since the moment she entered his life. "You were never the problem," he said quietly. "You were the truth they were afraid to see." Elena did not respond immediately. Her mind was overwhelmed with everything that had happened, the fear, the confinement, the uncertainty, and the strange connection she had formed with the most feared man in the empire. "Then what am I now?" she finally asked. Cain held her gaze for a long moment. "You are the reason everything changes," he said. Outside the palace, the empire was preparing for confrontation. Inside, something far more dangerous was happening, the rewriting of power itself. Cain was no longer just a ruler obeying structure. He was becoming the force that challenged it. And Elena was no longer a victim of circumstance. She had become the center of a shift that no one could control. In the final silence between them, Cain made his decision, not as a ruler, but as a man who had finally chosen something beyond the empire's law. Whatever came next would no longer be about survival alone. It would be about transformation. And as the story reached its final turning point, Elena realized something powerful. Her captivity was never just about imprisonment. It was about becoming the key to a world that was ready to break. And this is where the story reaches its end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more drama explanations and next movie breakdowns.